Welcome to the Feminist Therapy lecture. You'll notice from your textbook that this therapy or this approach wasn't developed by any one person, but was actually developed by multiple people. So that's slightly different from what we've seen in previous approaches. So let's go ahead and get started. So I came across this quote, I think in undergrad, and it's something that really resonated with me. And I thought, wow, it struck me as this is very true for me. If I'm not going to stand up for myself or advocate for myself or be on my own side, who else is going to? And this will make a little bit more sense in the next slide. So this author, Perez, wrote this book, Invisible Women. And there's a lot of different examples out there. I'll just cover a couple of them that basically highlight how our world is shaped and developed and built around men. So here's a couple examples. The formula to determine standard office temperature was developed in the 1960s. Think about who was going to offices and actually working in offices most of the time, most of the population during that time period. So the researchers paid attention to the metabolic resting rate of the average man. But a recent Dutch study found that the metabolic rate of young adult females performing light office work is significantly lower than the standard value for what men, what you would see in men doing the exact same activity. In fact, the formula may overestimate female metabolic rate by as much as 35%, meaning that current offices are on average, essentially, 5 degrees too cold for women. And if you're a woman who falls in this population who has been in an office with either a blanket thrown over your lap or, like 4 different coats or hoodies or something on to try and stay warm, then you've probably experienced this. And so, whereas if you look at your counterparts, right, men in the office are probably walking around in shorts or short sleeve shirts, and you're like, how are you not cold? It is freezing in here. I've been to a lot of different conferences for psychology or different trainings, and to me, it always seems too cold. So, hence, this is how we got here, because the optimal temperature was developed for men. Not only is this unequitable, it's bad business, because if I'm sitting here like freezing to death, am I actually being productive and getting work done? No, actually, productivity goes down, right? Because now you're either figuring out how to wrap up or stay warmer, or you're constantly running to the hot water kettle to make hot tea to try and stay warm, or hot cocoa or whatever. Now you're running to the bathroom more, right? It becomes like this on and on thing, as opposed to just like turn the temperature up a couple degrees. Here's another example. So men are more likely than women to be involved in a car crash, which means that they end up dominating the numbers of those injured or seriously injured in car crashes. But when a woman is involved in a car crash, she's 47% more likely to be seriously injured and 71% more likely to be moderately injured, even when researchers control for factors such as height, weight, seatbelt usage, and crash intensity. Women are also 17% more likely to die, and it's all due to how the cars were designed. So again, think about, when were the first car designs created, and when were cars first being built? Who was driving them? Who were they being built for? So women, because women tend to be shorter, not picking on anyone who's short out there, we tend to sit further towards the steering wheel when driving. And my husband actually, I'm not short for a woman, but he makes fun of it because I move the seat so far up that I'm really close to actually touching the roof of the car, like the ceiling of the car, so that, because I want to be able to see, like, I want to be able to see the hood and stuff. And he's like, why are you driving like way up here? Like, move the seat back. So women tend to sit further forward when driving, and this is, as I've said, because they're shorter, so your legs need to be able to actually touch the pedals, reach the pedals. And so women tend to also sit more upright, kind of like I just, I'm up here like looking over the dashboard because I want to be able to see, I want to be able to see the what's out there. That of course is not actually how that's not the standard seating position. Um, and so essentially we as women, if you're someone who finds yourself doing this, we're out of position drivers. And so our deviation from the norm means that we're at greater risk of internal injury on frontal collisions and, depending on the angles of our knees or our hips, because, shorter people, they're trying to reach pedals, that might put your knees or your legs or your hips or your ankles at more vulnerability depending on the impact of the crash or how the crash how the car is impacted. So cars have been designed and created, even thinking about testing car crash dummies, are based on the average male. So women, if we think about it, we're also at higher risk for rear end collisions as well. We have less muscle in our neck, in our upper torso, which means we're more vulnerable for whiplash, up to 3 times more vulnerable actually. And so I just want to highlight this because those are just two very small, maybe not small, but those are two examples of how our world has been created and built around men. And so if you start to think about this, I didn't put the citation on the slide, but if you just type in, Perez, and then, something like built for a men's world. I did put the citation in the references at the bottom of the slide deck. Um, you can see there's a bunch of different articles out there about this, and they cover lots of different topic areas and not just, I covered just 2 examples. And so go look up and see what other ways that this might be impacting you in a way that you've never even thought about. It's really interesting. Something else to think about and pay attention to is, and this is something that is covered in, this is something that's covered in your textbook, is thinking about gender socialization. And so if you type in gender socialization into YouTube, all sorts of interesting videos pop up. This video that is on the slide is it's not like a formal research article or research study or anything like that. But these individuals want to test this out, and I think this is fascinating. So what they do is they take these little kids. You can see this little toddler. He looks like a little boy. He's playing with, I don't know, some toy. And they essentially take these little kids and they cross-dress them. So he's dressed as a little boy, but this is actually a little girl. And so it's really interesting. It's only like 3 or 4 minutes. And they'll bring in someone who doesn't know, like an office worker or something like that. And they'll have them come, hey, come spend a few minutes and play with this little child. And they'll watch how this adult comes and approaches and plays with this child. And what they've found is that we all have these gender stereotypes. And so whoever the adult is comes in and they start to approach the child based on how the child is dressed, oftentimes. And you can see in the video that they actually even, they'll talk to whoever the adult is afterwards and say, like, what were you thinking in terms of what toys you were picking or how you were playing with the child. And they found that if the toddler was dressed as a boy, whoever was coming in to play with the child would actually play with them more kind of hands-on, like pick them up or, kind of be not rough, but just like more physically interactive with the child, as opposed to if it was a girl, they kind of, treated her like, oh, you're dainty. Oh, here's a doll. And so it's really interesting just to see how adults approach the child and treat them very differently based on if they're dressed as a boy or a girl. And then, of course, whoever is like creating this video behind the scenes that approaches the adult and says, well, as I said, they talk about, like, tell me a little bit about what you were thinking about when you were picking toys and what your approach was and what your thoughts were, etc. And then they'll say, well, what if I told you that, this little boy, little Johnny or whatever, is actually a little girl and her name is actually Rosie or Jane or, whatever. And the look of surprise that often, pops across this adult's face is like, oh, And one woman was completely taken aback, like, "Oh, wow, I didn't realize, or I didn't, I guess my stereotypes are present." And so it's interesting because that then, kind of going back to this idea of gender socialization, impacts everything, right? If you just think about who is in STEM, the STEM field, often it's men. It's become more women recently, as there's kind of been more of this push in the last, I don't know, maybe couple of decades, maybe not that long, towards getting women into STEM fields, into things like math and science and that kind of thing. But if you think about even from very early age, this little, well, it's a girl dressed as a boy, but this child, this infant, is what, maybe 2 years old, 3 years old. And from that age, it's here, play with cars, play with trucks, play with dinosaurs, play with robots, play with things that are technology oriented. Whereas girls, it's, play with dolls, play with, house cooking utensils, and, pretend that you're making dinner and cooking. And so from a very early age, we're treated very differently. And then that impacts other things like what career fields we choose to go into, what we choose to do for hobbies, etc., etc. So it has these kind of very ripple effects across who we become from an identity standpoint. And so that can be very interesting to not only think about, but also to bring into the therapeutic space in terms of helping clients understand their identity is based off of this socialization of who other people, caregivers, friends, family, society at large has told us how to be based on our gender. So this is something else that I want to cover, and I like to bring up within this class: beauty standards. So talking to women, how much time do you spend putting on makeup or doing your hair at the beginning of the day? On average, women spend 335 hours, or about 2 weeks per year, on their hair and makeup. So that equates to about 55 minutes a day. If you're if you're close to or within that 55 minutes, your average. If you're at like 90 minutes, then you're taking much longer than the average woman to get ready for the day. But where do these beauty standards come from? Let's go back to the previous slide in terms of socialization, but also, beauty standards regarding makeup, regarding how to dress, how to look. What is that driven by? Well, in environments where, women tend to pay attention very much to what men find attractive, that is what it's driven by, right? So if you're in a culture where men, find having pretty faces or a certain body type attractive, then women try and meet that. And there's a video, I'll put the link in the description. There's a video where it's different cultures in terms of what beauty is viewed as, and it's really interesting to see how there's different cultures. Like for example, Western society, right? We tend to kind of like this I guess Coke body, if you will, right? Like big boobs, big butt, thin everywhere else. That's kind of very kind of very generalized in terms of what people tend to like. Obviously there's individual differences, but in general, right, like the movie Barbie just came out, right? Like that's a certain body type. Whereas other cultures want something else, right? And so there's certain cultures where they want their women to be very big, like the bigger the better, actually. And so that also becomes a problem, though, because then women in those cultures are doing things to try and become thicker, like, eating chicken grease or eating like just fat or things that aren't healthy for their bodies to try and meet that specific beauty standard. And so if you've got time, watch the video. I think it's like, I don't know, 10 minutes or so, but it's really interesting to start to think about how our society drives beauty standards, and then how we as individuals try so hard to meet those beauty standards. And this isn't against anything. If you like to look pretty and you like to put on makeup just because you like that look, then that's perfectly fine, right? But that's very different from someone who's trying to look a certain way specifically to impress friends, to impress family, to try to get someone to like them specifically because they have that look. And that can start to cause a lot of problems for therapy clients. And this is something that I've worked with therapy clients in terms of, like, I'm not skinny enough, or I'm not pretty enough, or you know um I don't meet what someone else would look for in terms of, meeting societal expectations in terms of beauty, et cetera, et cetera. And so working with that individual in terms of, you know kind of challenging, not only advocating, but but challenging and helping that person feel more empowered, and working on that kind of identity piece of, well, who says that you have to look a certain way, or who's, like, let's challenge this idea that you have to look a certain way, or dress a certain way, or be a certain way. Like, where do those ideas come from? A lot of times society. And so, how do we start to challenge those so that whoever the therapy client is can feel comfortable and confident to just be themselves, as opposed to trying to meet some, a lot of times, unrealistic um, beauty standard that, has, like, why? For what? What are you going to get out of it? Okay, so we covered gender socialization. We covered some beauty standard things. Going back in terms of, there's another video that's by the Try Guys. So I'll put two links in the description below. One is for beauty standards for women, and one's for beauty standards for men. I really like the Try Guys video. They're funny. It's a group of four guys, if you're not familiar. There are a couple swear words in that video, but it's worth looking at because beauty standards go both ways. It's not just men, or it's not just women, but there's also beauty standards for men. And so, just for the purpose of increasing your own awareness around that, pay attention to what does that look like and how does that play out. So in terms of feminism, the word itself, I think, has some stigma surrounding it, and has sometimes been associated with things like being a man hater. Sometimes if you say feminism, or being feminist, people may assume that you're only talking about women, and that's not true. Feminism is now, today, currently, it's much more about being inclusive, and being inclusive in terms of wanting to engage and have this thought process and this dialogue and conversation about the idea of gender and how it affects all people, not just women, but men as well, right? Going back to what I just said about, like, there are also beauty standards for men, right? You gotta have a six pack, you gotta have, really good abs, you gotta have biceps, etc. So society says. Don't run around with a dad bod. I like that your textbook points out that the majority of clients are women, and the majority of psychotherapy practitioners are women. So it's fascinating because up until this point, most theorists that we've seen have all been not only men, but white men primarily. There were a couple, right? Um, Beck had his daughter who worked with him, and helped him develop at some point, right? Once she was born, etc. She started to, come in and help develop CBT. There were a couple others here and there, but overall, the person who was kind of the visionary, or really pushing things forward, was the male. And so it's interesting now that we're finally at a point where feminism has become a therapy approach, and has, as I said at the beginning of the slide, been developed by multiple women, which means that the theory and techniques may not be generalizable or applicable to all populations. So something to just think about and pay attention to. In gendered lives, so this means in most cultures, what is considered attractive to a female is defined by the men in that culture. And we just talked about this in a previous slide in terms of, how men pay attention to women's bodies. In Western society, women's appearance is given, tremendous importance because of that. As part of building out this slide deck, I was, looking around at different YouTube videos, and I came across one where the children are, from some country in Africa, and how they talk about their bodies and how they talk about being a man or a woman, even though they're little kids, they're probably like 6 or 7, is very different, I would say, than how kids here in America or in the West would talk about their bodies or talk about being a man or a woman. So if that's something that you want to learn a little bit more about, see if you can find something on YouTube. But it's very interesting. And I kind of talked about this as well in a previous slide, so I won't talk about it anymore here. So, in terms of principles, counselors cannot help clients recognize privilege and oppression if we ourselves don't understand how these identities have affected our own lives. So, again, you're going to hear this idea or this concept of, hey, we need to be working on our own stuff and paying attention to and trying to become aware of our own things. And it's one of those things that is a lifelong learning process, right? I'm sure that there are things that even if you know something, we're continually learning, we're continually growing. We all have blind spots or things that we're like, oh, I had never thought about that, or oh, I haven't thought about that, or paid attention to that. So let me dig into that. Let me explore what's going on there. And so part of this approach is being committed to monitoring our own biases, monitoring our own distortions or assumptions, especially in regard to the social and cultural dimensions of women's experiences. This approach tends to be much more egalitarian than, say, other approaches that we've seen. And so it's very much, again, working as a team with our client as opposed to we as the therapist being the professional and saying, well, here's what you need to do. You should fix this. Here's how, if you just do this, your life will get better. It's much more about what is your lived experience as a woman, or what is your lived experience as a man, wanting to pay attention to how, women's experiences are impacting or playing out, etc. This approach also tends to focus on strengths and tries to incorporate those into the therapy space. I'll talk about DSM criteria here in a minute, so let me not jump ahead of my slides there. This approach also pays attention to, of course, oppression in terms of how oppression has maybe been used against women or used against minorities in unhealthy or unhelpful ways. There's definitely a strong aspect from this approach in terms of commitment to social change, advocacy, trying to make change, make the world better for everyone, not just women or not just a certain population. So feminist therapy goals, I've kind of talked about this. See, I'm jumping ahead. I kind of covered some of this in previous slides. Striving for change, wanting equality. It's not about, like, oh, down with the man. It's more of how do we have balance and how does everyone have a seat at the table, so that everyone's voice is heard or there's equality for everyone, as opposed to, only one voice or one side of things being heard. This approach very much moves away from using the DSM or using diagnosis, essentially saying, like, hey, we don't know that that's helpful here. Let's look at what is this person's lived experience? What are cultural factors? How do we emphasize wellness and strength over disease? Being careful with cultural views of normalcy, so very much paying attention to what's normal for this culture as opposed to, well, here's DSM criteria, and so if you're outside of kind of these norms, then you've got something going on and we're going to diagnose you. But much more paying attention to what are cultural differences. And so an example of that is, I believe it's in Latino cultures, it's not abnormal that if someone passes away that you would, like have a conversation or see a loved one or, hear from a loved one if they've passed away. Whereas a DSM would say, oh, you're hearing or seeing things no one else can see or hear. That's concerning. We're going to diagnose you with something. This approach is very much focused on, of course, coping strategies, and identifying ways that support healthy coping strategies, as opposed to, again, not wanting to pathologize people, not looking for evidence of pathology, but more saying, okay, well, what's normal for you and for your culture? For where I work, it's better to start tentatively with a diagnosis. So, instead of saying like, well, here's what the DSM says, we're going to diagnose you with this, it's much more like, well, I think this might be going on. Let's kind of monitor it. Let's look at it. Let's see what's going on. And continue to gather information. And by continuing to gather information over time, over maybe 2 or 3 sessions or something like that, you can say, okay, well, here's the diagnosis that's going on. So again, part of this is also going to be setting specific, right? So if you're in a hospital, or a clinic, you can't, a lot of times you don't have the option to just not diagnose something because of your therapy approach. And part of that goes into like insurance, and insurance wants a diagnosis to be able to pay for that or have copays, etc. So from this therapeutic approach, pay attention to, there might be setting specific factors that you need to be thinking about. In terms of advocating, this approach, strongly supports advocacy, strongly supports volunteering, again, supports making change for individuals, minorities, etc. And one of the individuals that I think has done a magnificent job of showing this is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's done so much for women, so much for advocacy. If you're not familiar with her work, go look up some of the court cases that she was on and some of the things that she did to advocate for women. She was amazing. So just kind of in line with, the advocating and the volunteering, in 2022, Roe versus Wade was overturned. And again, part of our role as therapists, specifically, I think, from this approach is, paying attention to what's happening in the world and how that can impact us, but also how that can impact our clients. And then because of that impact, how do we take steps to advocate? And so remembering that this approach is developed from dissatisfaction with the limitation and the confining nature of traditional roles and society's oppression and oppressive stance towards women. And so, if there's dissatisfaction, then how do we challenge whatever that oppressive stance is? How do we advocate in a way that is, healthy, and in a way that supports others, etc. So research, the feminist multicultural therapy approach builds on work of both feminist therapy and multicultural counseling. So I think feminism is very much this kind of intersection between feminist, but also the multicultural side of things. If you haven't taken the multicultural class yet, it looks at multiculturalism. It sounds really obvious, but just different cultures and how different cultures interact, and how do we make sure that we're careful not to make assumptions, not to have biases, not to put people in a box just because, not to label them, etc. Paying attention to diversity and how having different cultures is actually really healthy, not only from a personal stance, but also from a work environment. And so feminist multicultural therapy is kind of a clash of these two different sides of things. And essentially, it's the idea that for us as women, being exposed to different languages, cultures, social classes, etc., helps us develop the flexibility and agility to navigate challenges and navigate oppression that we might experience in our lives. And oppression doesn't have to be something that's, massive, but just anything that is negatively impacting us, or things that could maybe be holding us back. So feminist multicultural counseling psychology takes a view of clients that is contextual and focuses on empowerment of all clients. And the intention or the purpose of this research was to understand how feminist multicultural therapy is conducted in practice with male clients. So there were 9 therapists total, 8 women and 1 male. And the procedures were they gathered a bunch of data. So they looked at demographics, interview protocol, and they used what's called a consensual qualitative research. And so CQR is an inductive method that is characterized by open-ended interview questions, small samples, a reliance on words over numbers, so it's more that qualitative, the importance of context and integration of multiple viewpoints, and a consensus of the research team. So it's essentially well suited to research that requires rich descriptions of things and inner experiences. So hearing more so that individualized experience as opposed to looking at thousands and thousands of data points. And looking at not only that inner experience, but along with that, attitudes, convictions, beliefs, values, etc. So some of the measures that they used to gather information, we already talked about demographics, but that looked at participant age, gender, race, ethnicity, years in practice, the practice setting, the number of clients seen per week, the education level, the orientation, etc. They looked at a bunch of different stuff. And they had 12 interview questions that they used. In terms of inclusion-exclusion criteria, this was essentially you must have treated a male client within the last 6 months and identify as a feminist multicultural therapist. Limitations. So this approach is specifically focused on smaller, a smaller participant size, but of course that then can limit the applicability of the research results to be generalized to anyone else. And the sample that they used was primarily female and predominantly white. And so again, the therapist views might not, or the data that they got might not be generalizable. Interestingly enough, they also only used therapists. They didn't also use their clients. And so in terms of future research, it would be really interesting if they did like a therapist client pairing to see, okay, well, what does the therapist say about this approach, or how are they answering questions? And then what is the client saying about this approach, or how are they answering questions? That would be really interesting. So it would definitely be helpful to explore, but not only both sides of that, but also paying attention to, are the therapists that they're researching, are they cisgender or not? And what might that look like? How might that end up impacting results? It is important to study how the intersections of different social identities, which carry varying amounts of power and privilege, affect the application of feminist multicultural, this framework or this approach. And the intersection of race, class, ability status, sexual orientation, among other aspects of identity, involve varying degrees of social privilege. So for example, I'm a doctor, but I'm also mixed, right? So I'm black and white. I'm a woman. So I have varying levels of privilege there. Being a doctor is also often associated with, having status and being privileged. But on the opposite end, I'm a woman. I'm not a male. I'm not Caucasian. I'm, mixed. And so it's interesting, and that's something that I do like about this framework or this specific approach, is that it looks at the intersectionality or the coming together of all of these different aspects of identity. In terms of results, so participants suggested not only that this approach, this feminist multicultural therapy, works for male clients, but also that it works in a way that other orientations do not. And that is by creating a space for male clients to open up about what masculinity or other identities mean to them and examine the influence of those identities in their life, which is pretty cool. And then in terms of this approach with male clients, it's also an approachable way to help men understand the contextual nature of identity and the influence of power, privilege, and oppression, and how those things might end up impacting the women in their lives. Especially, this might be beneficial, of course, for men who maybe aren't thinking about those things or have never thought about those things. Of course, future research is needed. Future research is always needed. Implications, why would you as a therapist care about this? Well, for therapists who work with male clients, again, it's going to be important to understand what is their lived experience, but also, depending on if oppression, privilege, influence of power, etc., gender stereotypes is at play, which a lot of times it is, maybe a little bit more subtly, helping, using this approach to help our male clients understand how that might be negatively impacting other individuals in their lives. So, for example, if you're working with a client, say he's a male and he comes in and he says something like, if only my daughter would just go become, I don't know, a secretary. Like, I'm trying to think what dad would say that. But, if he's like, well, if only my daughter would go, insert very stereotypical gender roles. Um, maybe not a secretary. I have had I have had previous students discuss and post in class discussions about how they have been raised in very stereotypical home lives where they are very much expected to be, pregnant and in the kitchen, or, you're a woman, you're expected to be at home cooking and cleaning and making sure that the men are taken care of. That I have very much had students comment about. And so if, your client is someone who is a male and who fits that kind of that approach of, if only my daughter would be at home helping clean more, or helping, with the kids, or, et cetera, et cetera, it might be an opportunity to help that client increase awareness and insight around how that might negatively be impacting the women or the individuals in his life. All right, that's what I've got for that. So, discussion post. Here is what your discussion posts are. The textbook does talk about different techniques, and so I didn't cover it because I want you guys to, you're reading your textbook, and so that seems like it would be a good discussion question. And that's what I've got for that. And here are my resources. Here's the one with Perez, The Deadly Truth About a World Built for Men. So if you type that in to your search engine of choice, several different articles will pop up. So check it out. It'll be really interesting to go read. And that's it. You guys let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Have a good week.